I'm here with Katelyn Beaty. Katelyn is managing editor of Christianity Today magazine, where she co-founded Hermeneutics. She has written for Books for Culture, Relevant, Prodigal Magazine, and Cultural Encounters, a journal for the theology of culture. Her first book, A Woman's Place, A Christian Vision for Your Calling in the Office, the Home, and the World, will be published in July of this year. Katelyn was also a featured speaker at the inaugural Frederick Beakman Writers Workshop at Princeton Theological Seminary. Thank you, Katelyn, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's a pleasure.
As you know, Frederick Beakman will soon be turning 90 years old. Is there anything you would like to wish him for this great milestone?
Well, I don't have so much as a wish as a note of gratitude. I think back on the first time that I encountered Frederick's writing in college and the way that his books shaped my faith and my relationship with God in a formative time in my life. And I know that my experience with him has been repeated by countless other people. And so I just want to thank you, Mr. Buechner, for the wealth of insight and knowledge that you have given us as your readers and given the church. And I hope at this time in your life you can look back and rest in God's delight in your work.
Thank you very much, Katelyn. I'm sure Mr. Beakman will greatly appreciate hearing from you. Next, can you tell me how you first learned about his work?
So I first encountered Mr. Buechner's work when I was a sophomore in college at Calvin College, which is a small Christian liberal arts university in Michigan. And Mr. Buechner was there to speak at the biennial Festival of Faith and Writing. And that was really the first engagement I had had with integrating faith and writing, but obviously Frederick is kind of a prime example of how to do that well. And so I remember going to hear him speak for a keynote address and then was soon introduced to some of his books. I think the first book that I encountered of his was Wishful Thinking, and referred to that a lot in my reading in college, especially his definition of grace and his definition of vocation. The place that God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet, and that continues to be a phrase or a motto that continues to help me think about my own work today.
What would you say most attracts you to Mr. Buechner's writing?
So I think Fred's writing is so wonderfully down to earth. You don't, as the reader, you don't get the sense that he's this guru who has God and the Christian faith figured out, but he's kind of journeying alongside of you as the reader, and he's very approachable. I think he also has a way of communicating truths that we have heard as Christians for a long time and are familiar with, and he has a way of talking about them that gives them new life and gives them energy and freshness and reframes them in a way that we haven't thought through before. And I think in doing that, he really helps preserve the reality and the vibrancy of faith so that it doesn't become a relic or just a thing that people have done for a long time, but it's a living act of faith. And I think that comes through in the vibrancy and the energy of Frederick's writing.
How would you say that his writing has influenced your career?
So I mentioned his vocational quote on where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet, and that actually is something that we at Christianity Today use every so often to talk about our own work as journalists and as Christians. I also think that his posture of humility in his writing is something that I hope to do in my own writing, that it's not approached as I figured out all the answers, but I'm figuring things out with God's help and grace. And I think that kind of humility and that humble posture is increasingly important as we seek to point more and more people to the goodness and reality of God.
More broadly speaking, what influence would you say Mr. Buechner has had on Christianity and the world at large?
Hmm. I think that Fred's writing is always it starts and ends with grace. You know that in his memoirs about his conversion to Christianity and his sense of vocational calling later in his life, there's this sense that grace has interrupted his life in a wonderfully fresh way. And so there's just the phrase that comes to mind is grace upon grace, that's the first and last word. I also think that he offers the world a sense of what it means to be free in the love of God, what it means to delight in that love as an embodied creature, and I think that that's a really important witness for our world.
I realize this next question is a little difficult, but if you were to sum up Fred or Fred's writing in a few words, what would you say?
I would say the first and last word is grace. And I think that is the constant beat behind all of Frederick's writing, and because of that, we have such a gift.
Well, thank you, Katelyn. Before we finish, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
I hope you enjoy the party. I hope someone's throwing you a big party.
Great. Well, Katelyn, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.